Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are broadcasting from the KWKY Mercy One Iowa Catholic Radio Studios here on this Wednesday. It's wonderful to join all of you today. I'm Bo Bonner. I am in Des Moines, Iowa, where I am the Director of Mission and Ministry at Mercy College of Health Sciences, mchs.edu, and the Executive Vice President of the Newman Idea. You can reach us at newmanidea.org. Bud, out in Pittsburgh, what are you up to there?
I'm the Director of the National Institute for Newman Studies here in Pittsburgh, and you can find out all about our work at newmanstudies.org.
It's good to join all of you today, and like I said, wonderful to be a part of everything that we're up to here in the Iowa Catholic radio world. Again, we know that this is an important time to make sure that everybody is reaching out, staying connected. We're entering into, I wish I could tell you immediately, Bud, like I had a sort of like clock or a calendar to know exactly, how long we've been under quarantine and all these things like this. But I'm just lucky that I remember it's Wednesday. So I don't know about you.
Yeah, my buddy had a meme on Facebook this morning that really resonated with me. It had the days of the week listed, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday down the line, but he had just crossed off the first part of each name. So it was just day. And I think we're all starting to feel a little bit like that right now.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's obvious things to do to structure the week when you have a radio show and like classes and things like this. But I'll have to admit that there's multiple times that I've been caught sitting on the couch and being like, I wonder exactly what day. Okay, yeah, I'm looking at my phone. Today is, in fact, this day. And I shouldn't complain too much. I don't know what the weather's been up like where you're at, but it was nice enough some of the past few days here in Iowa that the kids at least got to run around in the yard and breathe the actual air. And we've been able to open our windows. So that's been a nice, gentle blessing in the middle of all of this.
Yeah, the last couple of days have been gloomy, but on Sunday we had a beautiful day, and it's kind of strange to be outdoors and enjoy that and kind of know in the back of your mind, the news that's out there. But this whole conversation makes me grateful for all the people in our country who, are doing jobs that can't really stop or be altered too much, especially, trash pickup, grocery stores, but our nurses and doctors as well, for sure.
Yeah, I think the recruiting for grocery store folks is going to drastically change because I think they got a bad rap and it was always seen as like, oh, something that anybody can do. But now it's going to be the few, the proud, the grocery store workers that we greatly appreciate for letting most people be able to sit out the quarantine as comfortable as possible. I know many people are worried about work. Some people have lost jobs. It's more difficult for other people. But all things considered, pretty amazing what we're able to do to sort of shut down the country in most ways to be able to try to prevent the worst aspects of this disease.
Yeah, we are very grateful for that. And I hope, just as an opening prayer, that all of our listeners are staying as safe as possible within their circumstances. And please know that all of us at Iowa Catholic Radio have you in our thoughts and are praying each day and grateful for your support.
Well, and speaking of that, of course, we're always underwritten by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Mercy College of Health Sciences, of course, training up those future servant leaders we keep talking about. Well, the future's now, and I want to say that there's many of our students that both Bud and I have had that will be people here on the front line doing the great work. And I want to shout out to all of them. I've been able to talk to a few of them here in Iowa. Things, of course, we have hundreds of cases, but things are, still in many ways preparatory. And, they talk about the situation on the ground and facing these things bravely. But Mercy College of Health Science, very proud to be able to be a part of the people who've prepared for that. mchs.edu, Mercy College of Health Sciences, like most colleges, has gone online, for the foreseeable rest of the semester, of course. But looking forward to summer enrollments, fall enrollments, because no matter what's going to happen, the nation's next nurses, the next frontline workers, the next heroes would come through there. So Mercy College of Health Sciences, we thank you. And we thank all the people and our former students as well.
Yeah, it's been amazing to not only hear testimony from students, but just actually teaching a course right now, doing servant leadership. And normally that involves the students being out and about in the community, doing community service. But I've been impressed by seeing how my students have pivoted to basically trying to help their family members and closest neighbors and make sure that each person, like in their close proximity, is taken care of.
So again, we want to thank everybody for doing that, and thank you for allowing this show to exist as we go along. Today on the show, we want to welcome a friend of mine that I've met this year who should actually be in Rome because he got a new wonderful job. His name's Steve Metzger, and Stephen Metzger, Scriptor of the Latin Manuscripts at the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana, graduate of University of Notre Dame's Medieval Institute. But he has been detained a little bit, as you can tell, but here in the United States, and he's going to join us and talk about his specialty, which is the Middle Ages, and the fact that a lot of people associate the Middle Ages with plague and dealing with pandemic, and maybe what we can ascertain or gain or learn from what it means to know that things have definitely changed since the Middle Ages, but a lot has not as well. So Stephen Metzger, Dr. Stephen Metzger, Scriptor of the Latin Manuscripts of the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana, is our guest. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Budmar. Stick around. We'll be back right after these messages. We're back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Budmar joining you this Wednesday. It's wonderful to have you here, friends, and thank you for joining the show and reaching out. And we hope that we can be one of those social nodes of connection that Pope Francis has been talking about. So thank you for joining The Uncommon Good, Iowa Catholic Radio. Today's guest we're happy to have on is Dr. Stephen Metzger. Dr. Stephen Metzger is the Scriptor of Latin Manuscripts at the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana. He is a graduate of the University of Notre Dame's Medieval Institute and the author of the 2-volume Gerald of Abbeville, Secular Master on Knowledge, Wisdom, and Contemplation, and regular contributor at the Church Life Journal at Notre Dame. Steve, thank you for joining the show.
Great. Thanks for having me. It's good to be on.
So we live in interesting times. I don't know if there's any better way to, point that out. Might as well get that out of the way. Interesting for at least most of us. But however, you had a most recent article out on Church Life Journal, Reasons for Reading the Decameron Even After Coronavirus is Over, which is our mutual friend Artur. Did he come up with that title, or was that yours?
He came up with that. And it was in reference to, I guess, a trending Twitter hashtag on Sunday.
Artur Rosman is our common friend who's the editor over at Church Life, and good to know that he's on the pulse of what the youths are saying with the hashtags.
Right.
But you this article, I would suggest anybody to go out and read it. Church Life Journal, Reasons for Reading the Decameron Even After Coronavirus is Over. But you've written multiple articles on that website, and many of them have to do with the sort of fact that the gap between the modern world and the medieval world is actually much more porous than our imagination likes to throw out there. I've noticed that one of your favorite quotes is Thucydides talking about how human nature really doesn't change all that much, even if the circumstances do quite a bit. And so the Decameron, if maybe people don't know, maybe folks are a little more familiar with Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which were, these tales written in English after the plague hit England. But their real motivation was the Decameron. So if you don't mind real quick, just explaining people what that work was, and then we can get into why that should matter in the middle of an outbreak in 2020.
Sure, I can do that. Actually, Chaucer was inspired by the Decameron, and some people say he kind of ripped him off, but leave that one alone. The Decameron by a man named Giovanni Boccaccio is a remarkable collection of 100 short stories. And some of them are pretty dirty in body, and some of them are quite touching and poignant. And so it covers all of the aspects in many ways of human life. And they can be wildly funny, and it's a great resource. He has a setup, a frame that he relates as to why this book exists, and that setup is that 10 friends, 7 young ladies and 3 young men, and all of their servants and attendants are fleeing the plague as it's ravaging in the city of Florence. And so they're trying to get away. They're trying to isolate themselves by going into the country and sort of renting a country estate where they can, retain sort of some normalcy in this time of crisis and chaos. And as a way to pass the time and entertain themselves, they sort of all agree that they will tell one story a day. So the name Decameron means 10 days. And so each participant gives one story, and so the book is divided into days, and more like chapters, but then there are tales within the days. And so that's how you get the total of 100. So it's not a small book to read.
No, and when I think about this in terms of, you like you said, Chaucer rips this off. There's other people who do these sort of deeds where, well, if you're going to live in the middle of a plague or in the aftermath, what are you going to do? Well, what you have to do is tell stories. And as you said, the stories vary greatly between the holy and the profane in very stark ways. One of the things you and I have talked about that we hope to get in the show is that there should be something oddly comforting that humans have been dealing with similar situations in similar ways, despite all their differences across time. And not that anybody should go watch this either necessarily, but the fact that the Netflix documentary, The Tiger King, which is about a man named Joe Exotic who had a bunch of tigers and had a murder for hire scheme in southern Oklahoma, is basically trending as the thing to watch in the middle of this pandemic. If people think that's weird or some sort of like 2020 perversion, I'm like, no, this is kind of what humans do, right? Like, if we're going to be cooped up worrying about the imminent illnesses that are running around, we seem to find our version of something like the Tiger King, or maybe something more uplifting for other people. But this idea to hunker down and tell stories is actually very natural, it seems.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think that, because both Chaucer and Boccaccio have, very dirty stories in some ways, or at least, shocking stories, but that are actually quite funny. That there's this natural human impulse. It's kind of like the comic relief in a tragedy, right? You can't just keep pushing the tension. You got to break it at some point. And so you have these diversions, these funny stories that, you set into to try to insulate or isolate or just relieve your mind for a few hours, a few moments of all that's going on around you.
Stephen, Bud and Mar, thanks for joining us. I was really intrigued in your article by the section that talks about how the plague impacted theological and understanding, and that there's no greater locus of equality than in death. This insight, stands against the backdrop of, as your article points out, and even as we're seeing today, your status in society impacts how you can respond to a plague. So those who were more well off, many of them were able to flee and have some time away. Others maybe had that option but stayed for different reasons. And I'm wondering, for our listeners, if you could talk about, you mentioned at one point the Feast of All Souls, but how the experience of the plague around this time, and in Boccaccio's work specifically, how it impacted the way people thought about, conducted rituals around the experience of death.
Well, it's interesting because, Boccaccio, in as he's describing, this absolutely horrid way that the plague ravaged the city of Florence, as it did many cities in medieval Europe when it would show up, and how, the disease seemed to be unstoppable and nobody knew what was causing it, or they had very little idea of what caused it. They kind of knew that it seemed to be something physical. I mean, they knew that you could sneeze on someone and they would get it. They knew that it seemed to be transmitted that way. They knew that he has this description where, people, if someone died, they would go and burn the clothes because they thought maybe the pestilence was on the person's clothes. And so you have the social fabric of Florence starts to really break down. And Boccaccio marks that one of the ways you saw that was that, all of those rituals built up in Florence over centuries about care and how to treat the dead, all of a sudden were limited and forgotten in many ways, right? As the society broke down and people fled and people, turned in many ways against one another, that even this most basic human, action of caring for those who are dead started to weaken. But, the point, and so like, maybe one attendant or maybe one priest and that was it. Or you'd have, mass funerals where then people just thrown into sort of mass graves. They didn't want that contagion of being around the dead, since they thought that even the dead body could infect them. But the sort of the point I was trying to make was that, he's showing this in the sort of stark reality of death in plague, and showing that, he goes through these 4 or 5 different types of reactions to the plague, which I list there, of the various classes in society. And he has this very stark line, which is that, but none of these attempts to outrun the plague worked. And everybody was affected by it. There wasn't any escape from it. And so this, I tried to expand on that this was part of a medieval mentality that death comes for everybody. It doesn't matter who you are. You could be wealthy, you could be poor. And in that moment, we're all the same. And that this historically, with the Feast of All Souls, has been a way, more successful than not, of pointing out to society that, we all need each other. And the point with the Feast of All Souls was it was a way of telling, knights and lords and ladies and that there's going to become a moment where you're going to need the help of someone you don't know who it is, and it's not going to be of the same rank as you. But as Paul says in the letters, right, there is no distinction in society at this moment. We're all equal, and so it was an interesting way that I think that Boccaccio was trying to reinforce that as he's witnessing, because of fear and selfishness and just the panic of the plague. That people would tend to downplay that, right? Because it's just like, oh, someone's died, get them out of here. We don't want any of that. And to remind sort of everyone that, no, there is a certain common humanity and equality before God that we all have to maintain.
Well, and this might be another aspect about how hard it is to sort of jump the gap between our historical age and theirs. But a real way it exists. Of course, they don't have the sort of massive technological outlay that we do, and medicine and some of the things that we have. But certainly Florence before the plague was living high on the hog comparatively. And as you're pointing out, it's exactly that they could have seemed to, humans are often able to make themselves forget something that like their grandparents knew very well. We can put it that way. And so that they can get into the mindset that like, well, all the problems are in the past and in the rear view mirror. And then something like the bubonic plague back then, us dealing with COVID-19, is a great clarifier. Not only, we don't have to necessarily only be macabre or depressing and say that death is the great equalizer and the great, democratizer. But at these moments, we begin to ask, okay, well, what about that we currently care about is mostly fluff or ornament? And what is it that if we really had to say, no matter what, we would want to keep going on, we're going to make sure it keeps going on? And I think, I don't know about you, but those are the sort of conversations I'm starting to hear multiply all over the place, is these great clarifying questions about, in the face of all of this difficulty, what is the most important? Should we sacrifice things for the sake of the economy, for the sake of church? What are we going to do to make sure people feel like after this is all over, there's a real continuity? And I think that's something that humans make ourselves, we lapse and get surprised by things that people have had these conversations before. And maybe it just has to work that way because of how human psychology and attention works. But it's actually, I think, strangely hopeful to realize that this is something that humanity kind of has done before, and it's not uncharted territory for us to start having these conversations again.
No, I think that's very true. I mean, your point is well taken, especially that, I mean, Florence, as you noted, in the 14th century was a tremendously powerful and rich place, right? It was the center of Italian banking in many ways. The Medici family that would rise out in what we call the Renaissance, Florence. Florence was an amazing place. To have this, I think it was shocking to that society, which probably thought that it was insulated in many ways from these kind of plagues and pestilences, right? I mean, the Black Death, when it broke out in 1347 in Florence, the previous Great Plague, in many ways, people's minds, was probably the one from just the Emperor Justinian in Constantinople, right? And so it was like a shock. Where did this stuff come from? But I think that it is a sort of great revealing and sort of ripping away the mask moment. And I've seen this in many spaces online and talking with friends in that it's giving people a chance to pause and sort of focus on that of what really matters. And it is helpful to know that this isn't an abnormal part of human life. It's sad to say that it is, right? That, I mean, pandemics, plagues, pestilences have been affecting the human race for centuries and millennia. And so I think it's good. I mean, if you wanted to take a positive spin on it, in some ways, it's been a good thing for people to sit and have to reflect about, where are the priorities? Where do you find your treasure? And this has, unfortunately, been in a very stark way now that we're all, home and living with family and that kind of stuff. But I think it's not a bad thing either. I mean, I think that those times of life to sit and sort of contemplate and meditate on, what is it, to ask sort of fundamental question, what does it mean to be human? What are we actually pursuing? Is very meaningful and rewarding in some ways.
We can maybe get into this a bit more after the break, but you mentioned briefly in the article that sometimes the Decameron has been described as the human comedy in contrast to, and that made me think about discussions. Harold Bloom, the great literary critic, recently passed away, and he would sometimes press that the thing about literature is it's not meant to be moralistic, but it's to expose us to the transcendent, and like you said, really kind of display before us our own humanity. And I just, as kind of a teaser maybe for the second half of the show, is there a way to kind of encapsulate what Boccaccio is doing? Like, do you talk about despair in the final paragraph and not succumbing to despair in our own context? Is this a hopeful book, and how even does like Christianity enter into his art?
Yeah, I think it is a hopeful book. I think that that there is a progression over the 10 days from the very sort of vulgar and bawdy stories to the sort of great, and he even points this out, to great stories of sort of saintliness and virtue and this kind of stuff. And so to show that the human condition, which is why it parallels nicely with Dante, because it does, the plague is very much like the Inferno for him, and then you're moving out of it towards something more sublime. And so that literature can, just telling conventional stories, like, something like Tiger King, but it can, that process of telling stories and sort of seeing how human beings react and what our foibles are and our predilections, that can move us towards something that, is virtuous, or reveal to us who we really are, and then ask us these questions like we were just talking about of, well, what should we be, or what do we want to be, that sort of thing.
I have to admit that I'm pretty proud how often we've been able to loop back Tiger King into discussions about legitimate medieval literature and the plague.
Hey, it's Southern Gothic,
It is. I've heard it's Southern Gothic, and yes, I know people who went there, and then I remember him running for governor of Oklahoma. So that's a whole other story. But I will say that immediately when I read your article, Stephen, that immediately came to mind, where you could just tell that one of the great fallacies that we face is people thinking everything is brand new. And I guess, like, to be a weird nerdy braggart, one of my favorite lines that I always throw out, because some of the little Latin that I actually know, is nihil sub sole novum, so there's nothing new under the sun, from Ecclesiastes. And I guess, in your field, is that sometimes hard to convince people of, that, like, oh, truly this has to be completely different? And you're like, yeah, we have cell phones, we're magically talking over Zoom, but no, actually this has, like, people have talked about these things before.
It is challenging. I mean, it's the sort of great tragedy of my field in medieval studies is that it's been going on, in a serious way for probably about 150 years now. I mean, and in the Catholic world, Leo the 13th kind of gave it the great push with the encyclical Rerum Aeternum about the um, that Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure, and that should be the lights of the church guiding the intellectual renewal of the late 19th, early 20th century. And so, you get books written the last century or so that point out that the Middle Ages aren't dark, right? That they have insights that we can learn from, that they were a mature and flourishing civilization. I mean, it lasts in the conventional way we reckon historical periods for 1,000 years. This wasn't just where nothing happened and everyone sort of was, dirty and needed to take a shower and there was no deodorant. And so it gets frustrating to have to keep repeating that. But I think a number of books, not just like technical studies of, someone like, oh yes, they read classical texts before the Renaissance or before the humanists, but more popular books trying to disprove myths that people hold about, sort of unthinkingly about the Middle Ages and that. I think it's a bias that in some ways comes out of the Enlightenment, and it's really hard to get at and to undermine because we like the notion of progress, right?
No,
we
that's
like
true.
to think that, we're better than the people who were before them, which is actually it's quite contrary to a sort of Christian notion, but also a historical notion, right? Because we've probably all run across it at some point, the nice phrase that is often ascribed online to Newton, that we can see farther because we stand on the shoulders of giants. But that line doesn't come from Newton. It actually comes out of the Middle Ages. It's quoted in a work by a man named John of Salisbury in the 12th century in reference to a man named Bernard of Chartres who said it. And it's, that idea that, yes, we only are as good as us because our fathers and our forefathers and our mothers and that did this stuff and lived these lives. We don't like to admit that anymore, right? We like to think, no, it's all us. We're just brilliant. And everyone behind us was backwards in some way. And I think that's the temptation to try to overcome, because I think in the end, Thucydides is right that, the reaction of Athenians to plague in the 5th century that he recounts in his history of the Peloponnesian Wars, or the reaction to the plague that Boccaccio recounts at the beginning of his Decameron, not so different than how we're reacting now. And even the measures that we put in place, like to stay at home, right, to be quarantined, that's a medieval and earlier idea of how you stop a plague from ravaging.
Yep. No, nothing new under the sun. Hey, we're coming up on our first break. So Stephen, stick around. Bo Bonner and Dr. Budmar with Dr. Stephen Metzger. We're going to be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Budmar joining you this Wednesday from KWKY Iowa Catholic Radio Mercy One Studios. Thank you for listening to the show, and thank you for coming back. We have as our guest Dr. Stephen Metzger, Scriptor of Latin Manuscripts at the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana. He's graduate of the University of Notre Dame's Medieval Institute. Stephen, thank you for being on the show.
Oh, thank you. It's good to be here.
Now, if you don't mind, can you explain to us your really awesome job that you've not been able to fly over and do quite yet?
Right. So I have been hired by the Vatican Library to be what they call a scriptor, which is a title that I think goes back to the 16th or 17th century. And basically my job is, as maybe people know or don't know, the Vatican Library has a tremendously large collection of manuscripts, mainly from the Middle Ages, but some older and some newer, which of course are handwritten books, often on parchment, but sometimes on paper. And my job will be to continue the description and catalog of the Latin manuscripts in their library. Now you might say, wait a minute, the Vatican Library has been around for 500 years now. How is it that they still are describing and cataloging manuscripts? Well, like any large library, over time you kind of don't know what you have anymore. And so in the 1870s, 1880s, the man who was the prefect of the library at that point, a Jesuit named Cardinal Erla, he decided that it was time for the Vatican to do a scientific study of their manuscripts and present the results to the sort of academic public. And so my job is to continue that project of basically going into the library and finding what stuff they don't know they have, or maybe they know they have a little bit, but to sort of verify that it's there and what else is there. So it's kind of like a cross between Indiana Jones and a librarian, right? Like, I mean, to go hunting for new stuff in the library. Now, to be fair, like Cardinal Erla thought that this project would only take 80 years, and it's been over 100 now, and we're still going strong. So there's plenty of work to do.
Well, and not to make too much of a commentary on Italian culture, especially while they're dealing with such a bad pandemic. But on one hand, it seems to me everything I know about Rome perfectly on brand, that something that was thought to take 80 years is now mounting clearly over 100. And then also that you've been hired. And I mean, of course, again, like this is not their fault, but you've been given the thumbs up, but still have not been able to set foot in the place. So there's a lot of waiting and patience involved in Rome is what I'm getting at.
Very true. Yeah. So hopefully once this all calms down and the borders are reopened and everybody's sort of more or less back to some semblance of normal, then I can go over to Rome and start beginning this job, which I'm really excited to do. I mean, it's kind of a dream of a lifetime.
There's not really anything that you can't do that one at home. There's no zooming in for Scriptor of the Latin manuscripts.
No, not at all. I have to physically be there.
Well, we like for of course a host of reasons that like if you're over there getting to do your job, that means things are significantly better. But just for you, yeah, we pray and look forward to the day that you get to do this marvelously fantastic sounding job. So just to speak to that as well. A lot of people talk about the Middle Ages, the medieval world. I mean, I know I yab on about it as much as possible and tried to fight against like the Black Legend and the ideas about how bad these things are. But, you know, clearly if you're getting offered this job, you've immersed yourself in not just one or two of these books, but dove deep into, you know, the medieval world and the manuscript traditions there. When it comes to needing to rehabilitate, like you said, an entire 1,000 years, to sort of pick back up where we left off. What do you think the motivation is to try to act like we're not like the people of the past? What, you know, I think as some people would say, well, it's arrogance, or like, look at how spiffy and new our technology is. But is there something deeper in a sort of existential or human way that prompts us to try to cut off those deep connections that we have?
Well, that's an interesting question. I do think it comes out of the Enlightenment. So there is a harsh break, right? In this idea of the modern world that we're not going back, we're going to pull forward and make ourselves better. And so this idea of self-sufficiency, right? That we don't need the lessons of the past because we kind of know what we're doing. Which goes to a sort of, you know, pride or just, you know, feeling of self-sufficiency, as I said. I mean, it was interesting that there's an interesting little book by an Oxford professor, I think he was from Oxford, called The Tyranny of the Past, like or the Problem of the Past, something like that. And he talks about how with the advent of modern technology, and this was written in the 70s with computers and this kind of stuff, that you don't need anymore the lessons that historically have always been taught at home, right? Because you can't, you know, everything is sort of new now, or you can learn it out of a manual. You don't need your parents to tell you how to you know, those necessary things for life anymore, because, you know, when you go to work, that's not going to help you, right? Like how to sew or how to do all these traditional tasks, right? That's not the world we live in. And so therefore it seems that the past is no longer useful.
Yeah. Stephen, in this time, you talked about in the article, death is the great equalizer. I feel like in some ways, the experience of a pandemic puts an extra burden, so to speak, on theologians or cultural critics, because everyone's trying to make sense of what's going on. And unfortunately, already I've seen what in my estimation is sort of poor theology in thinking about this recent crisis and turn of events. So I'm curious, like in terms of providing some perspective, could you talk about how characters in the book, or Boccaccio as an author, how they made sense of what was, you know, clearly a very like psychologically bracing experience to have maybe half of the population of Europe to be decimated, you know, in a short amount of time. I know and some parts of the book he's drawing on this idea of Lady Fortune or the Wheel of Fortune. Were there like theological understandings that entered into that whole discussion as well?
There was. I mean, obviously, it was a very frightening time, right? I mean, it's still astounding to think about that in 4 years, we estimate 40 to 60% of the European population died, which is just tremendous, right? Like, you can't wrap your head around that, and that, the city of Florence, it took at least 4 centuries for the population to get back to where it was in 1347. And so there was a great deal of fear and despair, right? I mean, there's all the sort of trite explanations that people thought it was God's punishment for something, or that, there were all these, because they couldn't wrap their heads around it, right? But there is this, I mean, and it's interesting the way that it's carried on from ancient practices and philosophies of the ideas you mentioned of fortune, right? That, there was, I would say, much more of an acceptance that, life's not always going to be good. It wasn't so pessimistic as the Greek notion, that the Greek tragedians put out, that, you start to succeed and then the gods are going to come and get you and you're done. But just that, there's this ebb and flow to life, that some days you might be on top of the mountain and other days you're going to be at the bottom. And so the idea that then, the Christians sort of melded that to the notion of providence, right? That it, yes, you can't predict which way things are going to go. And, you could have a plague, be something, live through a war, something bad is going to happen to you, more likely than not. But to know that, like, there is a vision for this, right? That God sees the way things are going, and you can still live your life, and with that kind of hope. I mean, I think it's interesting that for the most part, even though there's this notion of fortune that the Lady Fortune will turn her wheel and you're going to be on the bottom of it, right? In the Christian world, there's still a view of hope, and the cross is the hope, and Christ is hope, right? And that it's not just despair. Which is very interesting, I think.
Well, to start melding a lot of these together, I think, what you said before Bud's question jumps into his, actually. So, we get this idea increasingly that, well, you don't need your parents to teach you the old ways, because you can get it online, you can get it from your job. I mean, like, increasingly there's this idea that we have a proliferation of knowledge. So this idea of, patiently passing on the past seems to be less and less worthwhile. But let me tell you, what are people doing in droves now? Well, they're all learning to sew again so they can make masks. And then there's so much sourdough bread being made right now. It's basically like an Amish novel that's occurring. And
Bo, I saw an exchange on Twitter, before this whole thing happened. Sometimes when someone would talk about, like, well, all the jobs have left my town, or manufacturing is going away, and others would maybe unsympathetically or dismissively say learn to code.
Yeah.
Learn to sew is being shot at
learn to
white collar
people.
work. Yeah. So the tables have turned a bit.
Learn to sew, learn to make masks. But sorry, that's good. I'm enjoying that too much. But to wrap that back into this idea of, like, fate, fortune, and providence, again, it strikes me as you will hear people say, Facebook is wonderful to let to be a sort of thermometer about, like, how some people are beginning to have conversations. But people will throw out, like, well, God can't be just if this sort of thing is happening. And I guess the only thing I could say about the true difference I see between 2020 and then, like, the various ways that people have dealt with this is, we're dealing with a disease that we've not seen in a long time, and the potential of numbers that can die is astounding. We should do everything we can to flatten the curve and everything like this. But it's not 60% of an entire population of a place, and that those people lived through that, where they couldn't have towns operate the way they used to because they literally didn't have enough people. But they don't talk about God and fate and providence in nearly the strident manner that we do. And if I'm throw out a proposal about you react to this, is I just sometimes wonder what we thought God was really doing all along. I guess if God is really just the person that makes the good times roll, or makes and I'm not even, it doesn't have to be flippant. I'm saying, like, if your idea is that like God is the sort of person that assures that you have a certain quality of life, I guess it can be bracing to face what we see, but that didn't ruin the faith in post-plague Europe. It drastically changed social traditions. It made huge arguments about theology erupt. But to me, that is the sort of interesting thing, is that if and why it is the case, the necessity of us studying the past so that we don't fall into that trap of acting like no one's ever thought about these difficult issues before.
No, I think that's true. I mean, it's hard. You think that, the Middle Ages, yes, they've talked a lot about death, and if you've been to churches that are sort of late medieval, early modern, that are kind of famous in Rome and in Bavaria, and that where you have bones everywhere, right? Like that, this was a culture that was surrounded by death. But I mean, the idea of 40% to 60% of the population just dropping dead for a reason you can't explain, even in a culture that's kind of, normally accepting of death as the eventual endpoint of human life, is shocking, and will force you to reconsider a lot of things. And I think it's even more so in this culture where, as other people have commented, that we tend to isolate death away from us, right? That it's not, people don't die in the home anymore; they die in the hospital or somewhere else, right? Like then I remember at a conference the other day, someone said that there's a growing practice of having funerals without a body in the casket, right? Like we try to and that something like this now, where you've got a disease coming that we don't know how to stop, kind of pierces you in a very deep way, right? It reminds you of that part of the human condition, which, we all kind of know is the end point, but we don't really like to admit it. And so as I was writing the piece on Boccaccio, the one sort of scriptural verse which I didn't put in, that was always in the back of my mind, was the end of the book of Job. So Job goes through all these things, right? And, I think that one of the things we could keep in mind too is that, when we think about God, it's like, all this bad stuff that we might consider bad stuff is happening to us. But when God shows up, you get on your knees.
Yeah. Well, we've been dancing around this topic in different ways throughout the show. But in reading the Decameron and the work that you've done there, I know Boccaccio presents a very textured humanity, and without downplaying that at all, could you point to maybe takeaways or practices or rituals that those who experienced that plague, ways that they continued to acknowledge each other's humanity and practice charity in the midst of very difficult circumstances?
I think that there was some, the ritual life of the church. Obviously, the religious orders and that tried to maintain to some extent the sort of the normalcy that had been built up before that, in terms of care for the dead and seeing still people's true humanity. And I think telling the body stories reminds us that you could say overemphasizes the good things in life. But just in the midst of all that suffering, reminds us that we are human and we have enjoyments and needs, and those can sometimes go awry. I think that there was the sense of trying to adhere to a life of virtue and prayer and that sort of thing, right? That that in the midst of a crisis like this, in some of the stories, that why hold up models of virtue when everything seems to be falling apart? Well, because that's still essential to the human condition, right? It's still essential for the pilgrimage on this earth. As ways to be reminded of that in a very sort of serious and real way. And as I tried to mention the thing, I mean, in the piece, this is not the first time that masses have been suspended because of disease. And then to emphasize that, the spiritual communion that you can still make to the sacrament, that sort of thing, right? That to reinforce that even though you can't physically be in the church, that can still happen. Right, the mass still goes on as a way of uniting the community.
Yeah, I hope that the hope that we get out of this, and again, folks, we're getting ready to butt up to the end of the time here, so make sure to go check out this article over at Church Life Journal. But what I would say is, I think that it's easy for us to get tricked into acting like this is an unparalleled moment for humanity. And in one way, even where we think it's most unparalleled, we go, oh my goodness, COVID-19 can spread like it does because of how interconnected the world is. But even the bubonic plague, even though it took longer time, I mean, that was a worldwide pandemic, at least in, the non-Western hemisphere. That came all the way from Asia and hit everyone. It was a literal event that nearly all of the cultures in that hemisphere could tell each other. And so I know that it's easy for us to think that we've never been here before, but not only the fact that the church survived, and it had a rough time because disproportionately the church clergy was hit, mostly because a lot of, like you said, the orders were trying to still reach out to people and be for them. But not only does the church survive, but humanity, when it comes down to it, we're a wily group of people, and we live in like astoundingly different weather climates. We've lived through astoundingly different horrible times. I don't want to say like we got this so that it's like this sort of cheery optimism, because as even the president says, the next 2 weeks, it's going to be quite painful, I think, for a lot of us to see what we see in the news. But we do, in many ways, deep on our bones, have the sort of genetic past that plenty of our where we come from, they lived through those things, and we can do that too. And the more we realize our sort of humanity, that shouldn't depress us. That should actually clarify things so that we can see that there's actually a road ahead.
Yeah, very much. I mean, that's the great thing about studying the past is not only do you learn something about yourself, but there is, I guess, a certain sense of comfort that, this is not new. It may be new in this form. Obviously COVID-19 was not known, before December or November, but, it's not the first time a massive disease has affected a huge number of people. And that humans are, in a sense, resilient, right? That we've lived through this. As you said, we live in all sorts of different places. There is a way to come back from this. And so, reading something like Boccaccio or Chaucer or any of these medieval accounts, help us to sort of realize that, right? And it might also give us some wisdom and some insight into how to deal with that.
Well, Stephen, it's been great to have you on the show. We thank you, Dr. Stephen Metzger, Scriptor of Latin Manuscripts at the Biblioteca, Apostolica, Vaticana. Like I said, his article over on Church Life Journal, there's more than one. I really suggest you go read them. Stephen, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Thanks, Stephen.
Folks, this is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, in our families, in our city, our state, our nation, the entire world, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good. We'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.